So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rebekah Demirel and Dr. Gabor Mate.
So thank you very much, Joe. That was a wonderful introduction, really kind words, and bless your heart, because this city's very lucky to have you and the work that you do too. So thank you. We're going to have a dialogue tonight. We're going to sit up here and have a dialogue. I'm going to get us started with a question, and we're going to talk a little bit. And we're also going to be inviting you into our dialogue to discuss whatever comes up for you. So if you could keep your questions kind of short and succinct, that would be helpful. And then, we'll just continue to work with you. And you can ask questions to Gabor or myself. And yeah, that's how we'll roll tonight. So Gabor, I want to get started with asking you about addiction. A lot of us have an idea of what addiction is to us, and there's many different definitions of it, but I'd like to hear yours and how you see addiction and what you see it as.
Right. So it's useful to look at the origin of the word, actually, which is a Latin phrase. And in Roman times, when you owed somebody money and you couldn't pay them back, you might have to become an indentured slave to that person. So an addictus was somebody who was assigned to somebody else as a slave. So the addiction, in its original meaning, has got this connotation of slavery about it.
Wow.
So what are we enslaved to? And as much as we like to believe that we are free people, free as a society, and free as individuals, in fact, your country, actually you're both Canadians here, so it's easy for us to sit here and insult the States,
Yeah, and I'll say once in a while. He probably won't. He's much more cultured than me.
Yeah. But your country, we're the land of the free. Land of the free, and by the way, I don't know if you realize this, but because of the war on drugs, while Americans make up 5% of the world's population, they make up 25% of the world's jail population, which means that every fourth person in the world in jail is a citizen of the land of the free. Now put that in your pipe and smoke it. But we all believe that we're free. Now, the Swiss psychotherapist Alice Miller, I think originally German actually, and moved to Switzerland, in her book, which is her most famous book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, the actual German title, in which she talks about childhood trauma, actually, and she was the one who opened the eyes of many of us, including myself, to the impact of childhood trauma on both myself and on virtually everything as a doctor that I see in medical practice. But the German title of her book is Prisoners of Childhood.
Wow.
And so what does that mean? It means that patterns that we developed in childhood to deal with the stresses or traumas that we encountered, so the way we coped with things necessarily as children, then become the bars of our prison, in which then we're incarcerated for the rest of their lives until we become conscious. So addiction is one of these self-imposed prisons, but imposed by the self because at a certain point we had to adapt to our circumstances in a certain way. And there are a number of ways to adapt to childhood stress or trauma. One of them is desperate self-soothing. So we can see this in infants already. Infants who are not rocked and held, they will rock, who are anxious, they will rock themselves. Or they will suck their thumbs or their corners of their blankets. Or they will play with their bodies in a masturbatory way, which has nothing to do with sexuality. It has to do with holding the self, because nobody else is holding them. So these coping patterns of self-soothing then become then, as we get older, translated into behaviors, which are, again, have only one purpose, which is self-soothing. So there's many more things I could say about addiction, but at its fundamental core, it is simply an adaptation to deal with stress or distress that otherwise would be unbearable. And this is an easy experiment to do. In fact, we can do it right now. I'm just going to ask some of you that are willing to acknowledge that you've had an addictive behavior of some kind in your life to put your hands up. And now let me define addiction for you. An addiction is any pattern of behavior that you crave that gives you temporary pleasure or relief in the short term, but negative consequences in the long term that you still persist in despite those negative consequences. So that's what an addiction is. And you notice I said nothing about drugs. I mean, drugs are one way, an obvious way, and the most socially ostracized way. But clearly, by that definition, there's all kinds of other addictions that do not involve substances at all. So if those of you that have had such behaviors and are willing to acknowledge it, just put your hand up. Okay, well,
Whoa.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask those of you that are willing to tell me, just put your hand up. We all know the negative consequences, but what did the addiction do for you in the short term? So what did you like about it? It did something for you. If it didn't, you wouldn't have done it. So rather than looking at it as something bad, let's look at what was good about it. What did you get from it? So, yeah, just yell it out, would you? You felt better personally. Okay, great. Thank you. Who else? Yeah. Escape from? It was escape from the present moment, which clearly you found too distressing. Okay, somebody else? Yeah. Sorry? Confidence. It gave you confidence. We'll take, yeah. It was familiar? Okay, great. So let's look at those 5 things that people have said. A sense of familiarity, confidence, made you feel better about yourself, escape from the present moment. I don't know what else may have been said, but escape from pain, in other words. Well, what could be more normal than wanting to have confidence? What could be more normal than wanting to feel good about yourself? What could be more normal than wanting to exist in the familiar internal, external milieu? What could be more normal than wanting to be without distress or pain? In other words, these are perfectly valid, normal, human desires. And in fact, they're so normal that there's no human being on earth who doesn't want them. In other words, there's something extraordinarily normal about addiction. And the real question is, well, how come you didn't feel good about yourself? How come you lacked confidence? How come you needed the behavior to give you that sense of familiarity? What made you a stranger in your own life? What gave you the distress that you had to escape from? What made the present moment so unendurable? In other words, what I'm suggesting is that stuff happened. And this is why the view of addiction as some kind of genetic brain disease is such nonsense. I mean, yes, you can look at the addicted brain through imaging techniques and scans and see brain abnormalities, but to assume that these abnormalities are somehow inborn, they're not. As Joe said in his introduction about the native population of North America, there was a certain set of experiences that then lead to those behaviors. And of course the brain is involved. But the brain is not an autonomous organ. The brain reflects our lives. So the real question always is, what actually happened? So what I'm suggesting, to summarize my answer to your question, is that addiction, what really is a normal response to abnormal circumstances, is what it actually is. Now, of course, it creates all kinds of problems on its own. So this is not to say that it's a good thing. But for a lot of people, it becomes the only thing, which for a while can help them endure what otherwise would be unendurable.
And that definition of a normal response to abnormal circumstances, that's the same kind of definition as critical incident stress. So when something happens that is outside your realm of experience or being able to relate to, then this whole set of physiological things happen, because our minds control, and our minds control our emotions control our nervous systems, and our nervous systems are what hook us up and keep us wired and make everything work. So naturally, what happens to us early when those areas of our brain are developing is going to have a huge impact on us later on.
Well, for sure. There's two things I'll say about that. One is that what medical students still don't hear, even though scientifically it's no longer even vaguely controversial, is that the brain itself is shaped by early childhood experience, particularly the relationship between the parents and the child. So the physiology of the brain is very much shaped by the environment. So when medical addictologists talk about addiction as a brain disease, well, okay, yeah, you can show that it has brain disease dimensions, but don't you know that the brain is actually shaped by the environment?
Yeah.
So that the brain disease is not the American Society of Addiction Medicine says that addiction is a primary brain disease. It isn't a primary brain disease. It doesn't begin with the brain. It begins with the circumstances that shape the brain. And from the scientific point of view, that's not even controversial. But for some reason, it does not enter the curricula of medical schools or the curricula of educational faculties, for that matter. That's the first thing when it comes to physiology. The second thing when it comes to physiology is I was a few weeks ago in the midst of a family meal, an extended family meal, my brothers and their wives and children, and one of my brother's 3 grandchildren. This is the Jewish Passover celebration. And I won't go into the details, but something happened. And this is me at age 70. Within a split second, I was in an altered physiological state. And I couldn't look anybody into the eye. And people looked at me, they would see a pained, isolated little infant on my face. And it had all kinds of implications for my behavior that night and my interactions with people at that table, because something triggered. And when I got triggered, I go into a different physiological state.
Right.
And that's what it means to have PTSD, by the way, is when your physiology changes in a split second, and all of a sudden you become this pained and helpless infant in the body of an adult. Now, six days ago today, I was in my living room, and one of the wonderful things about my life is that I do get a lot of people who are grateful for my work, and I just get a lot of love, out there. Sometimes I wish I could give myself the same love, but that's a different story, But nevertheless, it comes at me. And so this guy came over, somebody I met a few times. My wife was away at a retreat, a spiritual retreat, so I was alone in the house. And at some point, this young guy, who's not a therapist, just somebody with insight, he says to me, just let it out. And I didn't know what he was saying I should let out. But all of a sudden, there was I, on the sofa in my living room, shaking uncontrollably, my whole body convulsing. And I was screaming, and I was crying, and I was whimpering. And my head was bobbing up and down, and my neck was quivering. And this went on for 20 minutes, I'm told.
Something was in there.
Something was in there. And I said afterwards, boy, this is what I've been carrying on for 70 years.
Yeah.
And I totally got what happened at that dinner. Is that pain got triggered by something, and it doesn't matter to go into the details of it. The pain got triggered, and I have no way of releasing it. I had no way of releasing it. So I was thrown into this physiological state of emotional pain, but immobilized. And that's what trauma is.
Yep.
So, quite unexpectedly, it's not the least what I was anticipating or planned, but all of a sudden, it just poured out of me. And I felt a lot lighter ever since. And I'm pretty sure that it's not necessarily that that pain won't get triggered again. It's not that easy. But I'm confident that when it gets triggered, I'll see it and recognize it and understand it for what it is. And I will not have to immobilize it, nor will I have to act it out on other people. I'll be able to hold it and be a space for it, which, by the way, is what it means to love yourself. Loving yourself isn't a question of a gooey feeling of
It can be.
I'm so wonderful. I suppose it can be. I suppose it can be, but when you really love a baby, you love them when they're screaming, and you can hold them, And addiction is all about not being able to be with that pain.
Mm-hmm.
Just that desperation to escape the pain, and really, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because as soon as the pain starts arising in me in the form of boredom or in the form of stress or distress or unhappy thoughts or whatever, and I go and soothe myself with my addictive behavior, I'm actually further undermining myself because I refuse to be with my own pain. In other words, I'm recreating the very experience that traumatized me in the first place, which is that when I was an infant, there was nobody there to receive my pain. And now I'm unwilling to receive it. So every time I engage in that behavior, I'm wounding myself further. And that's not a self-laceration to say that, but that's how it works. And that's why addiction always makes worse, because you keep wounding yourself by your refusal, by my refusal to be with our pain.
And the worst part is if you're unconscious and that is happening, that can really push you deeper into your pain. But when you start to become conscious of it, you can actually catch yourself that, oh, here I am doing that behavior again, and self-soothing. And, the healing of addiction is not as much to do with quitting the substance as it is with healing the pain.
Yeah.
And if I could talk about Chinese medicine for a minute, there's this really cool concept in Chinese medicine. It's called bin and biao. And bin is root and biao is branch. And when practicing Chinese medicine, you're always trying to get to the root of the issue with people. And different than, say, Western medicine, where we put a Band-Aid on things. We don't so much try to get to the root of why does this person have an ulcer? Why does this person have insomnia? So bin is the root and biao is the branch. And for me, I can't help but thinking about addiction, whereas bin is the pain, and that is the root, and the branch is the manifestation of that, and that's the addiction, or whatever it is in our lives that we're doing to avoid the pain, to get away from it. So when we can get down to the pain, which is often the hardest part of working with addiction and with admitting to ourselves, where is this pain actually coming from, then we start to heal when we start to uncover it, like Gabor, screaming on the couch. That's just a peeling back another layer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a good analogy, the root and the branch, because in most of our approaches to addiction, we just keep hacking away at the branches.
Right.
And we're wondering why the plant doesn't go away.
Yeah.
We're not dealing with the roots of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and nourishing the roots too. Like, it's not always about, what's done above the surface. It's like, let's get down there, let's look at it, and let's, maybe these roots just really need some nourishment, maybe some water, maybe some food, and then maybe what comes out on the surface will be something that's more healthy.
Sure.
Yeah. Want me to ask you another question?
Why don't you do that?
Okay.
Why don't you do that?
I got some written down here. Speaking of childhood trauma, which you speak about a lot in the book, and it's certainly, for me, it's really valid. I had a lot of childhood trauma. growing up, a father who was a pedophile and mother leaving home when I was 3, and, just this very impoverished kind of childhood. So that led me to addictive behavior throughout my life that I didn't even realize I was doing. I was very, very unconscious for so long. I was talking to Gabor earlier about this, and actually when we first met, Gabor and I first met 5 years ago at Hollyhock, which is a retreat center in British Columbia on a little island called Cortez. And I went to this workshop where it was based on In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And during that workshop, it started to become clear to me what this addictive behavior had been, and I didn't even realize that my whole life, that what I was chasing, what I was after was not a substance. It was nothing to do with alcohol or drugs, and God knows I'd tried everything. But it was to do with the belief that I needed the connection from another person, that I could not be out of relationship with another person, that I kept looking for myself in other people's eyes. And that was when that really came clear to me, and how I'd always tried to avoid it and defend from it and blame other people and all the different things that I was doing. When that really started to come clear to me, then it started to release. But it took me, 40 some odd years. But it was that thing, like you say in your book, it's, how do you put it? Whatever happens in the dopamine-deprived person, whatever happens to touch those neural receptors and get them to fire and give us that release that we're looking for, and that chemical that's so euphoric and so stimulating, whatever does it, that's what your addiction is, and that's what you keep going back to, and that's the thing that's hurting you. So that was just really revealing for me to be in your workshop and for that to come to me. And I don't think I even said very much during the workshop. I just, from listening to other people, it just started to really filter down into me, which is what I'm hoping will happen to folks in here too.
Well, the point you're touching upon is the universal nature of addiction, so that if you look at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, it'll have internet addiction now, I think, and substance addiction, and sex addiction. Well, these are descriptions of behavior. Right. What the DSM does is it describes behaviors, like it'll diagnose somebody with ADHD, and somebody with OCD, and somebody with ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, and somebody else with this or that or the other. So they're describing behaviors.
Right.
Like personality disorder describes a certain set of behaviors. It says nothing about the internal life of the individual. So what the DSM does is it describes behaviors, but it has no idea that the behaviors are not the problem. It thinks the behavior is the problem. Mm-hmm. The behaviors are not the problem. What the behaviors are the person's attempt to solve the problem.
Right.
So addiction
Your adaptation.
It's an adaptation.
Yeah,
so addiction is an attempt to solve a problem. Obsessive compulsive disorder is an attempt to solve a problem. Right. It may be a dysfunctional and ultimately self-defeating attempt, but nevertheless, that's what it is. ADHD, the same thing. So whatever disorder people are diagnosed with, personality disorder. And so when you talk about relationships, for example, somebody with a personality disorder will have difficulty forming relationships. They'll either over-idealize relationships or they'll be suspicious of relationships, but they can't enter into real intimacy. So then you diagnose them with personality disorder. Well, what is that? It's the experience of the child who was so hurt in relationships that either she wants to be an infant to idealize the mommy or the daddy that will take care of them, or they won't enter into relationships at all because it's too hurtful to be in relationships. Mm-hmm. It's just an adaptation is all it is. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about your particular, and of course what you mentioned about the dopamine, that we think of drug addicts, then we think of behavior addicts. But actually, if you look at the brain chemistry of addiction, it's the same circuits that are involved in any addiction, whether it's sex or internet or heroin or cocaine. And the sex addict, or the relationship addict in your case, it's not the relationship that you're actually after. You're after that state when your brain is filled, suffused with the incentive and vitality chemical dopamine. But for you, it'll be relationships that'll do it. And for somebody else, it'll be shopping. And for somebody else, it'll have to be cocaine. But we're all after an altered brain state, which means that the so-called behavior addict is also a substance addict, except they get the substance internally.
Right. I've also heard
by
you
that,
say,
by that particular behavior.
I've also heard you say that the dopamine is at its highest level when you're just about to put your hands on that object of your addiction.
Right. It's in the getting. It's not in the having. It's not in the getting. It's not in the having. And of course, Eckhart Tolle says about the ego. Eckhart Tolle was a spiritual teacher. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work. Lives in Vancouver, and he says that the ego, the egoic mind, wants to want more than it wants to have.
Right.
So there's something very structured, so that the wanting itself is structurally a component of the egoic mind, which is why addictions are so rife. So that it's the wanting, it's not the having.
Yeah.
So in my case, all the shopping I did for all the music, it's not that I wanted to have it, it's that I wanted to want it. I want to get, it's the getting, it's that moment before getting. That's the highest state.
Right.
And if only we could always be in that moment. But of course, it only lasts a second.
Right.
And then we have to go back and want some more in order to get that height, because then we're fully alive. We just want to feel alive. Isn't that what it's all about?
Yeah.
We just want to feel alive. And the real question is, well, what's happened to us that we don't feel alive in our lives? And we have a whole culture in our society that's based on exploiting people's need to feel alive through all kinds of exciting and titillating behaviors and products and substances and situations.
Yeah, because for me, it was just all about, I didn't know who I was. I was so disconnected from myself that I looked in somebody else's eyes to see what was coming back at me. So I was looking for myself in other people's eyes. That's how out of touch I was. And
well, and you know what that is.
Yeah, well, yeah, and you talk about this. You know, the more out of touch we are with ourselves, the more we'll see a threat when there exists nothing, and the more we will not see a threat when it's there. So that also leads to dangerous behavior and self-destructive behavior.
Before I go there, that looking to see yourself in the eyes of another, that's the infant.
Of course.
Because the infant cannot know themselves unless they're known.
Right.
That's why being seen and being known is just the most important reflection that we can give an infant and small child.
Yeah.
And when we don't get that, then we're scanning the world until we get it. And now, ultimately, of course, we have to come to see ourselves, but nobody can see themselves without a mirror. And so that mirroring the child is just the most important thing we can do. When that doesn't happen to us, even if there's no trauma, but just if we're not mirrored, that's enough to set us off on a course of all kinds of dysfunctional adaptations.
Yeah.
As regards what you said about the seeing danger where there isn't any, or not seeing it where there is some, there are receptors in our brains, apparently called neuroreceptors, probably in the temporal lobe, that read danger. And that's our sixth sense. We talk about our sixth sense. You know, we have the five senses, then we have the sixth sense. It's a real sense. It warns us when there's danger. But to a child, when the danger came from the people that actually loved him, or should have loved him or her, those sensors can become confused.
Yeah, who do you trust?
Then who do you trust?
How do you know what trust is?
And then sometimes they'll see danger when there isn't any.
Right.
And act accordingly and alienate people. And sometimes it'll not recognize danger when it's there, and then you get into the dangerous relationships or dangerous situations.
Yeah.
And so that sixth sense, which is very exquisite in all of us, is confused when the early environment does not mirror us.
Yeah, I know I certainly put myself in a lot of dangerous situations, just to try to feel something, because I numbed myself so much to the pain of my childhood. But what I didn't realize then is numbing from pain, you can't really selectively numb. So when you numb yourself to pain, you're actually numbing everything and you start to feel dead inside. And so then that gives rise to trying to feel and being in situations that are dangerous.
Well, anyway, I still have not able to find this quote, but I can tell you the essence of it. And he says, and close to the very beginning of the book, that whatever you do, don't run away from pain. He says, whatever you do, don't run away from pain.
Who says this?
The author of Tibetan Book of Living and Dying.
Yeah. Okay.
He says, whatever you do, don't run away from pain. He says, be with your pain, because when we run away from it, he says, then we don't find out what we can through spiritual practice. And don't we know, he says, don't we know too well that when we try to run away from pain, we just create more pain for ourselves.
It's pretty much universal in any kind of spiritual thinking, right? That our pain is our teacher. Our pain is our roots and gives us so much information if we only just face it instead of trying to run away or push it away and medicate it.
Yeah, and it's also I'm just trying to read a new book. It's called What Matters Most by James Hollis, and he says, no matter how well-intended we begin, sooner or later, we all will spend good portions of this journey stumbling through savannas of suffering. Savannas of suffering, yeah. Wherein we nonetheless find tasks that, when addressed, even in those dismal, diminishing circumstances, enlarge us, going through suffering rather than denying or anesthetizing it. We will then retain the freedom of choosing what matters to us. So that, and everything I've ever done to escape from suffering, it just landed me in more soup. And that's the nature of addiction. And so that's the tragedy of addiction as well, is that we as human beings are desperate to escape from suffering, but then the way we try to escape is going to create more suffering from us. And unfortunately, in our society, rather than that being understood, and because to face your suffering, like what helped me face my suffering last Saturday, what allowed me to scream and shake, which is what an infant should do when they're in deep pain, is they should scream and shake is what they should do. But there was nobody there when I was a year old that could do that for me.
To expose what was there.
To expose what was there, but what that took is somebody empathetic coming over and saying, listen, I want to be with you the whole day and I just want to help you.
Wow.
So if we could actually do that for one another, be compassionate witnesses to one another's suffering, so that we could be witnesses to our own. But of course, that's not what society does. It does the opposite. It punishes and ostracizes and demeans and shames rather than acknowledging and supporting the expression of suffering.
Well, and yet, the common medical model of addiction is that it's a disease, right? Okay, so if it's a disease, why aren't we treating it like a disease? Why aren't we helping these people? Why are we putting these people in jail when they have this disease?
Even if it's a contradiction, and of course, even if we saw it as a disease, it would not be adequate, but at least be a step forward. I'd be curious about your work with traditional Chinese medicine. First of all, is addiction a concept that they understand or recognize? And secondly, how do they understand it?
Yeah, well, it's Chinese medicine has its roots in nature.
Right.
So it's, based in yin and yang, which is all the opposites in the universe, based in the 5 elements, thousands of years old, from China, obviously. And it was, developed out of people, sages probably sitting around and going, wow, look at the universe, look at everything around us. And so that's where it arose from. The concept of addiction probably wasn't something that was, talked about as addiction, but talked about as an imbalance. And there are emotions that are attached to each element, which is attached to the meridians, and they're attached to the seasons and colors and sounds and all of that. One of the organs that's really connected with the addiction and treating that in Chinese medicine is the liver. So the liver is said to control the smooth flow of qi, or energy, in the body. Okay. And so when emotions get blocked, so when they're not expressed, and when things just kind of keep internalizing and internalizing, there's actually a name for this syndrome. It's called liver qi stagnation. And so liver qi stagnation actually physiologically leads to, just like in Western medicine, where our mind controls our emotions, controls our nervous systems and immune systems, that same syndrome exists within Chinese medicine, so that the blockage of energy not moving is what is treated with addictions. Also the heart, anything to do with the mind, including addictions and insomnia, and many different things like that. Depression is treated by treating the heart, because our heart and mind are intrinsically connected together too. You know, what we long for and what we long to see is also what we long to be. And so that just kind of gets turned back in, and that's how we treat in Chinese medicine. It's the process of diagnosis is when I sit down with somebody, you know, I use my background in counseling, I use my background as a paramedic, and then I use Chinese medicine. So I'll talk to a person, of course, find out, you know, what their history is, what's going on, where is your pain, and when did your pain start, and what was your childhood like. And I'll ask them, what do you do to soothe yourself when you have pain? Then that's often a clue to things like addiction. And then we just take from there. There's a tongue and pulse diagnosis, which is, you know, we were talking about this on the way here, how tongue diagnosis was something it's kind of a folksy way that even Western doctors would use of diagnosing patients many years ago, not used so much nowadays, but it's a main part of Chinese medicine diagnosis. So anyways, using the listening to a patient, looking at a patient, palpating that radial pulse, and there's 28 different characters in the radial pulse, looking at the tongue, looking at the eyes for something called shen, which is spirit, and then just treating what's manifesting in the person at the time.
It's very interesting. I've had Chinese medicine diagnosis a couple of times, and each time they take the pulse, and as a Western trained doctor, when I look at the pulse, I'm looking at basically two things. One is what the rate of it is, or three things perhaps: the rate, regularity of it, and the strength of it. Three things. You look at 28 things,
right?
Which is strikes me as a bit more subtle, perhaps, than what I do. But picking on what you said, what's really astonishing about Western medicine is that. Let me tell you a story. So I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was done in San Francisco. And I was invited to speak there by Kaiser Permanente, which is a large healthcare provider. It's a large healthcare corporation, I guess. There are a group of studies called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies that were done by Kaiser Permanente, or in Kaiser Permanente's system, in California, that have shown that for each experience of childhood adversity, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, death of a parent, a divorce, a child or a parent being mentally ill or addicted, or violence in the family, or a parent being jailed, for each of these adverse childhood experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. Mm-hmm. So they multiply each other. And they rarely come in singles, you know. Not only does the risk of addiction goes up exponentially, but the risk of rheumatoid arthritis goes up, the risk of cancer goes up, the risk of mental illness goes up. I mean, everything bad.
Because the immune system gets attacked too.
Well, it's
depleted.
The immune system amongst other systems.
Right.
But here's the deal. So I'm going to go and speak to 200 addiction clinicians in the Kaiser Permanente system. These studies, the adverse childhood experience studies, have been published worldwide in major journals. major journals, and there's an increasing movement around them. In fact, if you don't know about them, you can look them up online, the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, and there's even a daily online ACE journal that you can get these days. Well, you got the picture? Adverse Experiences Studies, significant data to show the relationship between childhood adversity and adult addiction and adult dysfunction in general, done in California in the Kaiser Permanente system. So the organizers, a couple of months before the event, where I was going to speak to their clinicians, they asked me, is there some literature you could send us that would support your point of view? I said, yes, surely you've heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies. No, what are those?
Oh.
And it's entirely possible for somebody to go to addiction doctors for years and nobody ever asks them what you asked, which is, tell me about your childhood. That question doesn't come up. Now, that question ought to come up whether you got psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, or addiction. That's another story. But with addiction and that clear evidence, you know, and the evidence between the showing the impact on brain development of the early relationships, that the question of childhood never comes up in addiction clinics over and over and over again, and it's just all about the behaviors. And they keep repeating the mantra. Another article in the New York Times this week, addiction is a brain disease, addiction is a biological brain disease, addiction is a biological brain disease. They've got themselves mesmerized, hypnotized by their very narrow, and what that actually is, it's a self-soothing. The very belief that it's a biological brain disease is a self-soothing behavior.
There you go.
Because it allows us as a society not to look at the pain and the trauma that are experienced by so many people, and it allows the doctors themselves not to look at their own stuff. But you know, unfortunately, it also means that we're limited in what we can do for people.
Well, and psoriasis, you just mentioned psoriasis, and it reminded me that, you know, I spent my teen years from about 13 to almost 18 on the streets and in and out of foster care and stuff. And I had psoriasis during that time, which that's when it began.
Wow.
And it started my elbows, and went on my arms, it was on my legs, it was on my scalp, it was everywhere. And by the time I was in my mid-30s, it was really bad, and just itchy, scratchy, big scaly things. And gradually over the years, with just awareness and taking care of myself and, you know, letting out a lot of the pain that was inside, it's diminished. And as of 6 months ago, I don't have any. I had the last spot, was one spot on my ankle, and it's finally gone. But it took, 40 years for it to go away.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sure. And when we talk about it, even the word rash, it has other meanings, right?
It is what?
It has other meanings.
Right.
Rash, when somebody does a rash action or rash behavior, you know?
Yeah.
And what do we call it when the skin, what does the skin do when it breaks out in a rash?
It erupts.
It erupts.
Yeah.
And what happens is when the emotions are not allowed to erupt when they need to,
Right.
then the skin will erupt.
Yeah.
It's really that simple.
It is.
Now, there's all kinds of physiological reasons for that, to do with the nervous system, and the hormonal apparatus and the immune system. But of course, what is the mainstay of psoriasis treatment, from your experience, from dermatologists?
Cortisone.
Cortisol cream, right? And what is cortisol?
It's a stress hormone.
It's a stress hormone. So here's this obvious clue.
Yeah. And it didn't work for me anyways.
Right. And there's other treatments now as well, but we treat so many things with cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and we never ask ourselves, gosh, is it possible that stress might have something to do with this condition?
Right.
And the links are, again, it's one of these links that scientifically are being so clearly established, but they utterly escape medical notice. And when it comes to addiction, of course, to bring it back to addiction, when you ask people, well, let's ask it here. So those who had addictive behaviors, and then you gave it up for a while, and then you had a relapse, what usually happened before the relapse? Some kind of stress. Some kind of stress.
Yeah.
So the addiction also functions as a quick stress reliever.
Yeah.
As a quick stress reliever, because we can't handle those high levels of cortisol. We want to soothe them. So when you infuse animals with cortisol, they're more likely to use cocaine or alcohol to soothe themselves.
Yeah.
So again, when an infant is born, they have no capacity to regulate their stresses. They can't. So if you don't pick up an infant, you feed them and all that, but if you don't pick them up, they're going to die. Because they'll literally stress themselves to death. Now, the capacity to regulate stress, in other words, to have our stress response in reaction to a threat, but then to have that stress response soothed and calm down automatically, that has to develop. So that's a developmental attribute.
Right.
But for that, the conditions have to be right. And when the child was stressed and the parents could not hold the child in that stressful moment and relieve the child's stress, regulate the child's stress, then the child never develops the capacity to regulate stress. And then we turn to addictive substances. So I will give you another quote on that if I can find it.
And then maybe we'll open up for some questions, eh?
Absolutely, yeah. So let me just find this quote. Usually I can find this one pretty quickly, but maybe not tonight.
While you're looking, I just want to say too that, you know, the fact that my psoriasis took all those many years, decades to go away, and that it did go away was amazing to me, because I've been feeling my nervous system healing, and it's taken this amount of time and perspective for it to finally heal to the point where my body caught up with what was going on with my nervous system. It's a miracle to me. And it's a miracle, but it also, it shows me again the hope that we can all heal, that nothing is unredeemable to me, that everything can be healed if we have enough compassion, if we take enough time, if we have enough insight.
Absolutely. And that concept of the inner healing, that we have an inner healing force within us that needs to be opened and encouraged, that's utterly missing for Western medical practice. It's all about our interventions. So it's the suppression of symptoms or the cutting out or killing of disease.
Right.
But that there's a healing capacity inside people that is much more powerful than we imagine. That never occurs to us. I found this quote, and this is Almas, and he says, pertains to this capacity to regulate stresses. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he is with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen the way they should. The pain and the frustration, if they continue, they will have a disintegrating effect on the organism, and the child will begin to experience organismic fear for its very survival. And then he says, this is the healing part, if we can regain the capacity to spontaneously charge and discharge, in other words, if we can develop that internal capacity to handle when stress happens, have the tension and let go of it, he says. If we can change the rejection pattern when we try and reject our pain, which is what addiction is, and reconnect with our natural confidence and trust. I mean, in other words, confidence and trust, like your confidence. That's a natural quality of human beings, if they're given the right environment to develop it. But it has to develop. It's like, it's there in the infant, but it has to be nurtured. And if it isn't, then we lose the confidence. So he says, if we can change the rejection pattern and reconnect with our natural confidence and trust, we call that self-realization. Of course, we can also call that healing.
And resiliency, right? Having
Yeah.
that, restoring that elasticity to be able to take things in and also let them go
Let them
instead of
out,
just
yeah.
internalizing and driving it down.
That's right. And after that incident at that dinner a few weeks ago, I'm really grateful for the experience. I'm truly, humbly, and profoundly grateful for the experience, because it taught me something I really needed to learn. But there I was, and having written 4 books full of insight and appreciated by,
Millions.
I would like to say that, but let's say hundreds of thousands anyway, okay?
Okay.
Hundreds of thousands for sure, I know that. And having taught and having led seminars, but I couldn't let it out and let it in. I couldn't let it in and let it out.
Yeah.
I couldn't do that. I took it in, and it stayed in, and it felt toxic. And it took me 4 weeks to work through it.
Wow.
Well, I'm really grateful for that experience. I truly feel I've let go of something, but there I was, despite all that awareness, still having to do that. At my retreats, I often play, trite as it may sound, but it isn't. The Beatles had some extraordinarily wise lyrics.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when you consider how young they were and how, in so many ways, screwed up they were. But that song, "Let It Be," let it out and let it out and let it in, let it out and let it in, let it in and let it out. That's what we're talking about.
Well, we forget that we, if we were like, had a front door and a back door, we forget that we have a front door and a back door, and we can let things in, instead of closing it, we can actually let things in, because if we do have the ability, we can let them out, but that's what we forget. We forget that we can.
My wife, when we were having our 3rd child, she gave the experience of, it's like your little house on the prairie, and the prairie wind is just raging at the door. And if you block the doors, it might knock the house down. What you have to do is you have to open the front door.
Wow.
And you have to open the back door.
That's great.
She's talking about labor pains. You have to let the wind come into the front door, let it out through the back door, and then the house will stay standing.
That's great.
Well, and maybe with that, we can turn it over to you folks now. So if you have questions.
Dr. Mate, I want to better understand the role of cortisol, which
Sure.
you brought up recently.
Yeah.
That, there's the circadian quality of cortisol that is, it's part of our normal function.
Yeah.
But when it's dysregulated, I want to understand exactly how that works with stress and how that is connected to addictive behavior.
Okay. So cortisol is a stress hormone. The word itself comes from the word cortex, and cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. So the cortex of the brain, the cortex is like the bark, the thin layer that covers the white tissue of the brain, is the gray matter, the cortex. So the adrenal gland, renal means kidney, adrenal means on top of the kidney. So the adrenal gland also has a cortex, a thin rind. And so cortisol is named after the cortex where it comes from. So cortisol comes from the cortex of the adrenal gland. And the other hormone that comes from the adrenal gland, of course, is named after the gland itself. So it's called adrenaline. So you have these 2 stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And how that works is that if you perceive a threat, not only if there's a threat, but if you perceive a threat, and the perception could be valid, it could be entirely imaginary, but it doesn't matter. If you perceive a threat through a cascade of influences that begin in the emotional centers of the brain, and through the hypothalamus, which is a master gland in the brain, and then through another gland called the pituitary, and eventually to the adrenal gland, you'll get the release of adrenaline and cortisol. Now, there's certain base levels of adrenaline and cortisol, and then you mentioned there's a daily rhythm to that. But apart from that baseline levels, there are surges of these stress hormones when there's a perception of threat. And the reason for that is that adrenaline will give your muscles more strength, will send your heart pumping more rapidly, so more oxygen is delivered to the tissues of the muscles, so you can fight or escape. And at the same time, the cortisol, amongst other things, elevates blood sugar levels, so again, you have more energy for the defensive or flight behaviors that you need to engage in. So that's good. But in the long term, those same stress hormones will damage you. So adrenaline will give you high blood pressure, narrow your blood vessels, increase the risk of heart disease, and so on. Cortisol itself, well, in the long term, if it stays elevated, it will cause ulcerations in the intestines, thin your bones, so you get osteoporosis, put fat on your belly, more risk of heart disease, make you depressed, suppress the immune system, and also shrink certain key organs in the brain. So think Alzheimer's as a stress-related disorder, actually. And so therefore there has to be a mechanism to regulate our stress hormone levels. We have to have the stress response, otherwise we can't fight back or escape, but it also has to be regulated. So there's a feedback mechanism that allows, when cortisol levels get too high, some mechanism will kick in to turn off the flow of cortisol. Okay? But if people are stressed in childhood too much, that feedback loop gets dysregulated. And now you don't have the regular or the normal dampening mechanism. So people get stressed and they stay stressed. Mm-hmm. That lack of self-regulation is lacking. Now, one of the ways you can soothe yourself at that point is to have a drink, or to do cocaine, or to engage in sexual behavior, or to go and gamble. So this is how stress then shows up as a trigger for stress that's not regulated naturally, then is one of the triggers for addictive behavior. Does that answer your question? Okay, great, thank you. So lots of hands have seen that. No, actually, if you use the mic, it's a whole lot better because
goes through the sound system.
They're not going to hear you at the back. Over there.
Right here.
Hi, I have a couple questions. I currently work in residential treatment for pregnant and parenting women.
Right.
And the state has just cut quite a bit of funding in Washington State for state beds.
Really?
And I'm just wondering what your thought is on treating addiction. And we're going to shorter treatment. And this treatment that I work in is 6 months, which is a great length of time, but very unusual. And the second part of the question is how do you feel about the 12-step program and how that fits into treating addiction? So
you work in a facility for pregnant women with addiction issues, and the state has just got the funding for that. So now you have fewer beds. That means that 15 less women will get treated. Is that right? Okay. So the state these are what the politicians call the tough decisions. Mm-hmm. And what they mean by that is this decision is going to be tough on the most vulnerable. Right. It's not tough on us because we still get our salaries and our perks, but it's going to be tough on people who have already lost so much. That's what they mean by tough decisions. And I don't care whether they're in Canada, British Columbia, Ontario, or Washington State, or Louisiana. When politicians talk about tough decisions, they always talk about decisions that are tough on the most vulnerable. So that's what's happened here. What the state has done in its fiscal wisdom is to make sure that it's going to cost them a lot more money down the road. Because how the pregnant woman fares has a huge impact already on the future of the infant. The brain and the nervous system begins to develop in uterus. And we know that when pregnant women are stressed or pregnant animals are stressed, their offspring are much more likely to engage in addictive behaviors. And of course, the treatment whether through medical means or the incarceration of addictive behaviors, is much more expensive than the prevention. And so my point in my book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, I have a chapter, an appendix on prevention, that the prevention of addiction needs to begin at the first prenatal visit. So, let alone the inhumanity of that decision, let alone the utter lack of compassion in that decision, from the strict financial point of view, they've screwed themselves. But of course, that's okay, because the decision makers who made that choice will not be around 15, 20 years from now to see the impact, or 30 years from now to see the impact of the decision. That'll be another set of politicians who will also make tough decisions at that time. But it's so short-sighted, whether we look at it from the human point of view or any point of view, but even from the strict economic point of view, it's utter madness. And it's this constant tension in our society between the short term and the long term. And we're always choosing the short term. Now, what do we call that? What's the essence of addictive behavior?
Short term.
It's the short term over the long term.
Right.
We're run by a bunch of addicts
Yeah.
in that sense. So that's what I got to say about that. And it's frustrating to watch, painful to witness, and one heart just aches for these women. As to the 12 steps, it's a difficult question because, the people that have been saved through the 12 steps are naturally grateful and naturally insistent that that is the way. But statistically, it's hard to know because they don't release statistics about how many people start the programs and how many finish them. So we don't know how effective they are. It's effective for the people for whom it's effective. But that's all we can say about it.
But it's something, right? It's a
well, no,
proactive step.
I'm not putting it down.
Yeah.
Anything that works is
Right.
great. So for the people that works, it's great. So, but we don't know how effective it is. We only know that it's effective for the people for whom it's effective. Because we have nothing to, there's no study. There's no, the studies that have been done, unfortunately, are not very encouraging in terms of its global success. That's not a criticism because nothing else is that effective either. So if you get anything that works for some people, that's fantastic. And there's nothing to be scoffed at. In terms of specific critique of the 12-step programs, I have one major one, which is that they too tend to consider only the behavior, and they look at it from the point of view of a disease. There's nothing in the 12 steps that necessarily leads you to consider childhood trauma, leads you to consider the actual origins of your behavior. So I think now I have to tell you, some of the happiest people I've met have been people who used to be addicted and then done through the 12 steps, and they continue doing the 12 steps. And these people have a kind of a groundedness and a joy about them that I could sometimes only envy. So I'm in absolutely no position to say anything negative about them. But I do think that could be far more effective if they actually understood that it's not just this disease that you've got, but actually it was a coping mechanism and that you had plenty of good reasons for trying to cope that way. I think they would go deeper and further. I also don't quite agree with the formulation. As much as I appreciate it, I'm so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic. I know what they mean. What that person is doing is publicly acknowledging their dysfunction, and that's a courageous step. And that's great. But there's a danger in it. Because nobody is an alcoholic. The alcoholism wasn't who they ever were. It was just a response to something. So even the word addict, I wish we didn't use the word addict. I wish every time we talked about an addict, we would say the following. We didn't use the word addict or the word alcoholic, but we would say, here's a human being that for no fault of their own suffered so much when they had no choice in the matter that they began to use this particular substance to soothe their pain. Now, what if every time you use the word addict, that's what you said instead?
Yeah.
What would that, or if you talked about yourself that way too, what would then do to the conversation around addiction? So that's what I would say about the 12-step groups.
Gabor, can we talk about harm reduction? And because some 12-step program people believe that harm reduction and 12-step
Incompatible, yeah.
are incompatible, yeah.
That's the other thing I didn't say about 12 steps, so thanks, is that some of them tend to be a bit dogmatic. Now, I can't generalize because some are not and some are. And every group is different, by the way. So a group in this part of Seattle might be very different from the 12-step group in another part of Seattle. But some of them are very intolerant because they go out of the alcoholic tradition. And with alcohol, even with alcohol, you can show that harm reduction works. But of course, the 12-step models are abstinence-based models. And so for them, the idea of harm reduction, which means that we do things for people even while they're still using. Mm-hmm. So I was talking to somebody today who would like to begin a supervised injection program in Seattle. Well, from the 12-step perspective, that's kind of anathema because you're still using and you're actually condoning using. Well, nobody's condoning anything. What you're actually doing is making sure that people don't inject themselves or other people with HIV. And how can you argue with that? Mm-hmm. Or that by using clean needles, or if they overdose, they get resuscitated. Well, how can you argue with that? You know, but I've heard some 12-step based people talk about how this kind of harm reduction is a condoning or encouraging of addiction. Well, it isn't. The fact is that there's no one size fits all. So for some people, you need harm reduction. For another people, 12-step is the ideal method. And for somebody else, something else might work. So I think we need to be very broad-minded in how we look at addiction treatment and recovery and realize that people are at different stages of development and there has to be something for them wherever they are at and not demand that they all come up to the same standard. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Sinan, lots of hands.
This is not really to follow up on what you just said, but I have questions about the role of punishment and how we as a society seem kind of addicted to punishment as a way to resolve issues or to deal with things.
Sure. Well, we live in a society, it's very interesting. I'm just finished reading a novel, which I don't know if it's been published in the States or not, but it's received many accolades in Canada, and it's a very popular book. And despite the fact that it's popular, it's also very good. You know, that's because most popular. Because my usual comment is, if it's popular, it can't be any good. Because if it was any good, it wouldn't be popular. But in this case, it's both popular and good, and it's about the interface between the Europeans, the Jesuit missionaries that came to what is Canada now, and the native, the Huron and the Iroquois. It's a wonderful novel, based on a lot of historical research and very beautifully written. I just finished reading it, waiting for this event to begin. Anyway, something I knew about the European response to the natives is that when the Europeans came to North America, they were completely appalled by the parenting practices of the natives. And you know why they were appalled? Because the natives didn't hit their kids. Mm-hmm. And the Jesuits would write about this. So in this novel, there's this paragraph. It's fictional, but I know it also reflects the actual opinion of the Europeans, because I read that elsewhere. So he says, this is a Jesuit missionary writing about a Huron village. Children and dogs run around without care, rolling in the dirt with one another. If there's one thing I will never grow accustomed to, it's the savages' inability to chastise their children. In all my years here, I've never even seen an adult even raise a hand in anger toward a child. Indeed, this should be one of the first behaviors we must try to modify. Because, of course, in the eyes of the followers of the gentle Jesus, if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, you know? This is Christian mercy at its best. And it's so contrary to what Jesus said, because Jesus actually says that don't suffer any harm to come to these little ones, he says. That if better than you should suffer yourself to do any harm to these little ones, better you should try a millstone around your neck and throw yourself in the water. That's his actual advice. And so in North America, we have this punishment ethic, which shows up in the drug addiction field very saliently, and the war on drugs, and I already talked about the incarceration rate. And of course, if you understand what I'm saying about addiction, Rebekah, do you have your copy of Hungry Ghost there with you?
What do you need?
The copy of Hungry Ghost, yeah. So I read you a paragraph from my book on addiction, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. So this is a quote I often cite. Let me just find it.
See, I read it a lot, right?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, here it is. So, Detective Sergeant Paul Gillespie, head of Toronto's Sex Crimes Unit, rescued children from the purveyors of internet pornography. As the Globe and Mail, a Canadian newspaper, reported on his retirement from police work, 6 years at that job had not inured him to the horrors he witnessed. And then the Globe writes, Paul Gillespie still can't get used to the sounds of crying and pain in the graphic videos of children being raped and molested that he has seen all too often on the web. It's beyond horrible to listen to the soundtracks of these movies, said Canada's best-known child porn cop. But it is the silent images of desolate children that tear most at his heart. They're not screaming, just accepting, he said, of the infants captured in his pictures. They have dead eyes. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. Well, I could make any number of points here, but in response to your question, the point I'm making is, if the same policeman had been transferred to the drug squad, who do you think he'd be chasing in the streets? Those same kids that he didn't rescue. Because according to all the literature and all the evidence, they're the ones who are most likely to become addicted. So here's what we do. We take people that were abused and traumatized from the early age on, and then we further traumatize them. And this is what we call justice. Well, it's not called the criminal justice system for no reason. It's a criminal system in terms of what it does to people. And as Dr. Bessel van der Kolk was a justifiably world-renowned trauma expert at Boston University, said that virtually 100% of the people incarcerated in the United States were traumatized children. And this is our approach. Now, this is our approach to addiction, but it's also our approach to child rearing. So parents, these days, instead of being helped to understand what the child's behavior is all about and what the child is actually acting out, like what is behind the acting out behavior, they're just told, if the kid does that, you do this. If the kid does this, you do that. So we have these punishments. Then the punishments no longer include physical beatings. That's frowned upon now. So we find other ways to do it. Some of them are at least as bad. For example, the timeout technique. When you say to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, one more time and it's timeout, and then when the kid naturally does it again, then you separate from them. What you're actually using against the child is their worst fear of abandonment. And we call this discipline. And what we're actually doing is we're punishing a kid for a behavior he's got no control over. And the message we're giving is that you're acceptable to exist in our presence only conditionally. Now that conditional acceptance, that conditional invitation to exist is wounding. Imagine being in a relationship and your partner says, well, I got to tell you something. I love you very much, but if you displease me, time out. How long would you stay in that relationship? So this wounding of children, which we call discipline, is deeply entrenched in North American society. It's in the schools, so bullying, zero tolerance. Now who's the bully? The bully is a wounded kid who needs to make themselves important. Now, the way to deal with it is zero tolerance. If you look at the research, zero tolerance, zero evidence that it works. But that's what we do, reflexively, and not reflectively, but reflexively and automatically. And this is ethical punishment and the vindictiveness. And what is that all about, actually? Well, all you have to do is listen to the talk show programs and the wounded people that call in with their rage, and the popularity of cop programs where the bad guys get it. We would all want the bad guys to get it, because we all suffered so much as kids. We all suffered so much as kids, and we had no way to strike back. So now we have these socially sanctioned ways of striking back, which we call justice, or we call child rearing. And because we don't have the compassion for ourselves, and because we're unable to be with our own pain, therefore, we just want to punish. It's toxic. It's toxic, and it creates more suffering. Doesn't matter what level, it creates more suffering. Okay, Sinan, right there.
Hi, Gabor.
Hi.
Just as an FYI, the book you referenced by Joseph Boyden about the Jesuit missionaries, that author is in Seattle this Monday night at Elliott Bay Bookstore at 7 o'clock.
Oh, fabulous. Well, go, for God's sakes. It's worth going. The book is called The Orenda. The Orenda, yeah. Thank you for letting us know. There's a question in the second row here, Sinan, right there. Lady with the pink shirt, put your hand up again. Yeah. She came all the way from Nigeria to hear this talk, so.
Well, I wanted to know what social or family dynamics cause ADD or cause the brain to change so that people manifest ADD behaviors.
So what would you like to know?
I want to know what social or family dynamics
Lead to ADD?
Lead to ADD.
Oh, sure. Well, you may wish to read my book on the subject. The American title of which is Scattered. Now, the Canadian title was Scattered Minds. And the American publisher didn't think that the American public would understand the word minds, so they just called it, I don't know what to say. So they just called it Scattered, you know. Anyway, here's the deal about ADD. It's not a disease, contrary to what my colleagues say. The hallmark of ADD, which I was diagnosed with age 54, by the way. That's why I got interested in it, and it became my first book. And the hallmark of ADD is the tuning out, the absent-mindedness, just the not being there. You know, the tuning out is not a disease. What is it actually? It's an adaptation. It's a coping mechanism. It's when, if you were threatened or stressed, you would fight back, change the situation, or leave. But if you couldn't fight back, change the situation, or leave, then your brain would tune out the stress just so that you could endure it. Now, it was in Seattle that I found out that the brain develops in interaction with the parenting environment. I came to these lectures here by a couple of leading lights in the field, and that's totally changed my worldview. But I already intuited that ADD wasn't a disease. It began as a coping mechanism. So here's the thing. So if you take a child, and remember that quote that the child is very sensitive and feels the stress in the parent? So what happens to children that are born into families where there's a lot of stress? There might be a lot of stress because of economic pressure. There might be a lot of stress because the parents are isolated and they don't have the help. There might be stress because there's childhood stuff that the parents resolve, so they keep fighting each other. There might be stress because of war, whatever. So the child is born into a stressed environment. He can't change the situation or escape it or seek help. How does she deal with it? Or how does he deal with it? By tuning it out. When is this happening? When the brain is developing. There are times in the first year of life when every second there are millions of connections. In this space of time, literally millions of connections are being made. Well, guess what? The tuning out becomes programmed into the brain. That's kind of the default setting. And then we diagnose the kid and we medicate the kid. What do we medicate them with? with a substance that elevates the level of dopamine in the brain, such as Ritalin or dexedrine. Now, you take infant monkeys and you measure their dopamine levels in the brain and you separate them from their mothers. Within a week, the dopamine levels have fallen. So the child's brain chemistry is actually programmed by their relationship with the mothering parent. So when you have a society such as ours, where parents are increasingly stressed, where there's more and more single parents, where even both parents have to go to work to make a living, where there's less and less family and community and neighborhood and extended family support, we have a lot of stressed kids. The result is that in the US, there are 3 million children who are taking stimulant medications and 500,000 who are taking antipsychotics. And there was an article just the other day about how the rate of ADHD in Finland is the same as in the US, it seems, but the number of kids being medicated is much lower in Finland, because there they deal with it by trying to deal with the social dynamics around the child. So what we have is stressed societies, stressed parents, stressed children, the coping mechanism of tuning out, and then we have this pharmaceutical-dominated response to it. And that's what we've got, a perfect disaster. So if you're interested in reading more about that, my book is called Scattered. I don't know if it's sold here tonight, but it's...
Yeah, it's sold out there.
Okay, so you're welcome to.
And it's interesting, too, the way, whether it's ADHD, autoimmune-related disease, or addiction, that those three things have really the same etiology.
Absolutely.
And that is that early trauma which alters our brain chemistry.
Well, there's a psychiatrist at Harvard called Judith Lewis Herman, who in 1995, I think, published a book called Trauma and Recovery. And she says there's only one psychiatric diagnosis: complex post-traumatic disorder. Mm-hmm. And it's true. That's all there is. Everything else is a variation on the theme.
It's 4 minutes to 9. Did you guys want to sum up and then sign some books out there, or did you?
I'd rather take questions, actually. I don't have anything to sum up, so.
Okay, one more question.
And well, a couple more. There's 2 hands way at the way back. Why don't you go way back there and take those 2 questions? Keep your hand up at the very back, okay? So Sinan can see you. We'll take 2 questions and that'll be it. Okay?
Hi.
And, yeah, go ahead.
You seem to place a lot of emphasis on connecting the original trauma and how that creates the manifestations in current life and
Right.
such. In situations where, for example, I have a lot of awareness to, well, it could have been this prenatally, or this at age this happened, or this happened, and that's what creates me to be this way or to respond this way. And oftentimes you can't know 100% for sure that that's exactly what caused it. It could have been something else. But I guess my question is, and I'm kind of confused in it, when you brought up the 5 beliefs that your son was asked to describe, I could identify with the not having value or feeling unsafe. And then, so my question, I guess, is when you've done a lot of digging and you've kind of identified where these things come from, how do you instill a belief that you actually do have value, if that's a deep-held belief? And what ends up happening, for example, and I'm almost done, is that in my addictive patterns, I'll say, okay, I'm participating in this addiction because at this time I did this, and I can connect it all together, and then I'll say, but I don't really care. I'm gonna do it anyway, and then follow through with it. So I guess the question is, how does one instill compassion for themselves? How do you change the beliefs that you're not valuable? And does that make sense?
So, all right, so thank you for the question. How do you feel about yourself when you engage in those behaviors?
Of course, poorly afterwards, but it does
No, tell me how you feel about yourself afterwards.
Ashamed,
You feel
guilty.
ashamed, okay. So, you know where self-compassion would begin? It would say, begin by saying, I'm a human being who right now haven't found a better way to soothe my pain. So I'm going to forgive myself. So self-compassion has to start in the present. It's not some trait that you acquire. And then, it's actually, you have to have compassion for the person that shows up in your life right now, which is you and your addictive behavior. I have to have compassion for the person that showed up at that family dinner and behaved in a certain way. And I have to say, yeah, you know what, Gabor? That night, you didn't know how else to deal with your pain.
Okay.
So it's got to start in the present, And you're quite right. Simply identifying intellectually the sources of your trauma are not sufficient. I've always known what happened to me. But that knowledge did not release me from the pain. That takes more work. It has to begin by accepting the pain. It doesn't matter which of those 5 things that happened to you, or all of them cumulatively, led to these self-beliefs of yours. That's only important because otherwise you just see yourself as somehow naturally flawed or deficient or morally decrepit. And if you actually understand that, no, really, not to justify anything, but those behaviors, they did come out of something. And it was my response to a kind of experience that no child should have had to endure. So that's important. But you're quite right. That doesn't by itself releases you from it. So you have to begin with that self-compassion. And that self-compassion needs to be for the person that you actually are. And if right now you're that person who still engages in addictive behaviors, then have compassion for that person and see what that feels like. So that's where you need to begin.
Thanks.
And it's not a matter of instilling any beliefs. I could do affirmations till the cows come home. Mm-hmm. I'm a soul. I'm a child of God. It all may be true, but it's meaningless, right? No, it's not a question of instilling a belief in your own value. From another perspective, value is a natural quality that you have simply because you exist. So it's not a question of talking yourself into having value. It's a question of seeing what's in the way of your acceptance of your value. Oh, there's this belief that I have no value. That's why I try to impress that person so much with my intellect, because I believe I have no value. Oh, so that's what that was about. So just see the way in which it shows up, the belief that you have no value. And the more you can see those behaviors compassionately, the more your natural sense of value, which is already in you. And by the way, how do I know that it's in you? How do I know that that natural sense of value is in you? How do you think I know that?
You choose to believe it?
No. You showed me that. Do you know how you showed me that?
No.
Who do you think asked me the question? If you didn't value yourself, why would you sit in a group of 200 strangers and ask such a courageous question? Something in you says, I'm valuable enough that I want to know the answer to that question. I matter. I'm going to put my hand up. I'm going to speak out. That part of you is your value. It's not a theoretical thing I'm talking about. You demonstrated your value right here by the very fact that you valued yourself enough to bring yourself here tonight. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you then.
Thank you.
Then I'm very grateful for all of you for listening and for Rebekah for being my partner in this conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.